It was spring of 71 BC, and on the banks of the Seli River, the last pitched battle of the Third Servile War was about to take place. It was here that the rebel army would make its final stand against the legions of Crassus. At this point, it had been 3 years since Spartacus and his original group of 78 gladiators broke free from their confinement in Capua. At the point of his final battle, Spartacus stood at the command of nearly 40,000 men. This army had survived 3 years in the heartland of the Roman Republic, and until this point had vanquished every force that had been sent out to meet them. They had waged a war of guerrilla tactics, playing cat and mouse games with the legions that tracked their movements, only halting in constant movement to decisively humiliate whichever Roman commander had unwisely walked into the trap. Until now it had been true that when Spartacus was leading the rebels into battle, they did not suffer defeat, and nor could they really afford to. Like Hannibal more than 100 years prior to these events, they roamed about Italy reaping the rewards of Roman defeats in the form of plunder and loot. But in exchange for these spoils, they would face the inevitable backlash of a Rome that would not give up while a despised enemy remained at large in their own lands. With the benefit of hindsight, it was certainly a mistake that on the back of earlier victories, such as the defeat of Claudius Glauber at Vesuvius, that the rebels did not choose to leave Italy. The ancient historians, however, did not lay blame entirely on Spartacus himself for the bad decisions that led up to the final battle. Plutarch wrote that after the defeat of Lucius Cassinius, who was a Roman general that suffered the indignity of being slaughtered in the bath of his own villa, that Spartacus tried to head for the Alps and disperse his men back to their own countries. At this point, however, the men refused to obey him. The historian Barry Strauss wrote in his overall estimation of Spartacus that by this point, Spartacus may well have suffered the same fate as many a revolutionary leader. He had set a fire that he could no longer control. The men under his leadership appear to have rejected his wise counsel of fleeing from the place of their bondage to chase either further spoils or vengeance against their former masters. The Roman historian Florus is one ancient commentator who attributed revenge as a key motivator to the rebel cause, but their motives have been the subject of much discussion. From the evidence in the source, Spartacus clearly displayed a cooler head than maybe his followers did. Appian writes that after turning back from the Alps, Spartacus had designs to march on Rome itself. At this point he was personally undefeated and led a force of anything up to 120,000 people. But this figure no doubt includes women, children, and potentially prisoners. Even with these numbers under his command, he did not get caught up in the overconfidence that flowed amongst his men, and correctly deduced that he did not have a suitable force to take the city of Rome. Primarily because although the runaway slaves had been resourceful so far, they were not going to be able to craft siege engines or possess the necessary experience in this form of warfare. As far as Rome was concerned, the mere existence of this war was dishonourable. The enemy they faced were slaves. It is a theme that runs through all of the Roman sources that this conflict, and the failures of the Roman military to deal with it before that it spiraled out of control, was a source of much disgrace. The defeats of their commanders to Spartacus were compounded symbolically, as the rebels stole their standards and fasces. These were paraded around Italy as a recruiting tool, proof to any would-be rebels that Rome was indeed vulnerable. Losing a standard in battle meant disgrace, and their future return would be of great cause for celebration, or in this case probably relief. Oresius makes the irresistible comparison of Spartacus to Hannibal in his account of the history, and this is something I've been guilty of so far as well. And the historian does this, in some way, just to explain the reaction of Rome. They were legitimately scared of what this rebellion meant, both for the military prestige of the legions, and also the very social and economic foundation of Roman society itself. And the response of a fearful Rome was to place one Marcus Crassus in command. If Spartacus had shown himself to be a cool head, at least in terms of his intentions, then his foe displayed throughout his career that he was colder, methodical and calculating in matters of business, as well as military and political strategy. Rome handed Crassus praetorship and the command of 6 legions. The fact that he could afford to raise these armies would have no doubt factored into their decision. His obscene wealth is common historical knowledge. Upon being granted command, Crassus set out with his legions to track Spartacus. It appears they had a few engagements leading up to the final confrontations. The first reported confrontation occurred when Crassus sent his lieutenant Mummius ahead with strict orders not to engage the rebels. For whatever reason, Mummius disobeyed and was soundly defeated by Spartacus. Following this initial setback, there would be a few more encounters that Crassus was reported to have won, and within a few months of his command, he would have pushed Spartacus to retreat down towards the southern tip of Italy, the toe of the boot of Italy. In order to understand how the conflict between Crassus and Spartacus played out, it is crucial to get a picture of the army under the Thracian commander. Although it may not be correct to fixate on Spartacus purely as a Thracian, because the sources such as Plutarch determine that he had a more Grecian way about him than others of his homeland. Now this may have merely been a tool of the Roman authors to excuse any admiration they had for his valour and his skills as a commander, partly because admiration for a Greek mind in Roman society was easier to explain than admiration for one of a barbarian slave. So based on the sources, it's likely that Spartacus fought in the Roman auxiliary. The Romans lacked elite cavalry, and the Thracians produced some of the finest light cavalry in the ancient world. It could also be deduced from his battle record that he may well have been an officer before he fell foul of the Romans. The sources dictate that he was first designated a deserter, then a robber, and finally captured and condemned to slavery as a gladiator. The ethnic makeup of his rebel army was primarily Celts, Germans, and Thracians, all famously warlike throughout the ancient world. They also held a simple but frightening advantage against the Romans they faced in battle, in that on average they were taller than them. And this height disparity has been confirmed in ancient sources, primarily those focusing on the numerous Gallic wars between the Romans and the Gallic peoples, and also in archaeological findings. So with a variety of ethnic groups clearly came some problems, however. The Nobel Prize-winning classicist Theodore Mommsen theorized that the division in Spartacus's ranks, he was writing in about the 19th century, that a division in his ranks likely fell down Hello-Barbarian and Celto-German lines, with the latter group likely siding with Crixus in the earliest known fracturing of the rebel forces. Crixus and his men would be wiped out by consular legions in 72 BC, shortly after leaving the main group. Plutarch specifically notes that Spartacus grew his forces by actively recruiting shepherds and rural farm workers. These workers would often be Gallic or German. It is unlikely that many Italians joined Spartacus's cause, although some Italians may well have silently supported an enemy of Rome, presumably by leaving the rebels unimpeded as they travelled through the rural areas. This is because you've got to remember the social war between Rome and the other Italian peoples was still active in living memory at the time. Plutarch describes that shepherds and rural workers who joined made for scouts and light soldiers. It's an interesting note that very few urban dwellers took part in the rebellion, even though the cities were full of potential recruits trapped in slavery. But perhaps with the army not suited to sieges, they instead focused on easier targets for plundering. The makeup of the army, being that of rural agricultural hands used to surviving in harsh conditions, may suggest why the rebels were so adept at waging guerrilla war. Notably, another general of the time, famous for guerrilla warfare, Sertorius, was actively waging war in Hispania parallel to these events. He also recruited the local herdsmen into his forces. Beyond the recruits he found in rural Italy, Spartacus also found himself able to build a suitable cavalry for his army. Florus notes in his history that they broke in herds of horses they were able to find while wintering in southern Italy. And among the rural herdsmen there were more than enough horse tamers. Strauss notes in his book that the Celts held a particular reputation for horse taming at this time. So a man well versed in Thracian tactics like Spartacus would have been suited to commanding these forces. They specialized in light infantry and light horsemen, attacking and defending high ground, hit and run attacks, ambushes, and stealth. Thrace was also a nation that respected strategy in battle, and Spartacus from his personal history as well would have known war the Roman way, how they acted in battle and in order to counter it, but also the importance of organization and discipline. And with regards to his battle record, Spartacus, for his part as a military leader, proved himself the better of at least 7 different Roman commanders if we are to go by Plutarch's account, although in the accounts there is notable divergence between him and Appian. This tally also includes at least 2 of Crassus' subordinates in Mummius and Scroffa, both of whom apparently acted in defiance of Crassus' orders. And how was Crassus himself as a general? Well, he's no doubt a decent battle commander, but his record may not have stood up to the geniuses found amongst his Roman contemporaries, and up until this war his main military accomplishment had been 10 years previous. He led the right wing of the infamous Roman consul Sulla in his battle against the Marian faction at the Colline Gate. This battle plan hinged on Crassus' performance, but it was Sulla and not Crassus that had formulated the plan that day. Nevertheless, he played his part competently and was able to rest on this achievement in Roman society. He would spend the intervening years amassing a fortune that appears to have been unrivaled at this time. Additionally, he may well have been suited in experience to counter the threat posed by the rebels. His father, Publius Licinius Crassus, served as a governor in Hispania Ulteria, and during his tenure he secured a victory for Rome over the Lusitani, a barbarian foe who used similar tactics to those reportedly favoured by Spartacus. The younger Crassus was known to have spent time with his father in Hispania, potentially granting him some insight into the tactics the Lusitani used. It would be remiss of me, though, when reviewing Crassus' ability as a general, not to touch on his eventual death. He would for his final venture attempt an invasion of Parthia, where he was serving as governor in Syria. An escapade designed to yield even more wealth and laurels to this leading citizen of Rome, the invasion would prove disastrous, as the Parthian army, relying on cavalry, specifically horse archers, ground down the Romans, slaying Crassus' son, and forcing his soldiers to the point of mutiny. He would eventually meet his own end when attempting parley with the enemy that went badly wrong. But with this story I'm getting a bit too far ahead of the subject matter at hand. The general strategy of Crassus had been to slowly grind down the rebels, knowing that they could not survive forever in Italy, and Rome would eventually be able to defeat them with the use of enough resources. Spartacus' attempt to escape into Sicily had failed. He had attempted to barter passage to the island from pirates. Whether the pirates had betrayed him or simply refused to transport him to the island is unknown, but the rebels were unable to make the crossing. It is speculated that Sicily was the staging ground for the first 2 Servile Wars. Spartacus may have seen the island as the last hope for long-term success. Facing no other options, he wheeled his forces round back north, and on the about turn he found that Crassus had fortified the isthmus at Rhegium. An isthmus is a narrow piece of land connecting 2 larger pieces of land. Crassus had found the most narrow point in order to trap Spartacus in the toe of Italy. The Roman military's ability to build fortifications at speed is frankly a marvel in ancient history. At times their strength lay mostly not in their renowned heavy infantry, but they were essentially an army full of skilled engineers who could build under even the pressure of enemy attacks. The Battle of Alesia is a famous example of where ingenuity in fortification building made it possible to win the day, despite seemingly overwhelming odds. The Romans built one wall in order to besiege the town, and also a second wall to defend from the reinforcements who had come to break the siege. Another prime example was the Battle of Dyrrhachium, where, for lack of a better description, the armies of Pompey and Caesar attempted to outbuild each other with fortifications. Caesar was trying to pin Pompey to the coastline, and Pompey was aiming to stretch Caesar's line as far as he could. This situation caused a race in fortification building. Now Crassus' war with Spartacus predates these battles, but the skill of his army in building fortifications was no less impressive. Plutarch specifically noted the speed at which Crassus managed to trap the rebels, and no doubt this was an incredibly costly venture to build such a wall. As Spartacus faced the wall, it is clear he began to show a sense of desperation. A striking story present in Appian's account details that Spartacus crucified a Roman soldier in the no man's land between Roman fortifications and his troops. It can be surmised that this may have been to scare the Roman legionaries, but Appian makes it quite clear that the primary intended audience for this horror were the Thracians' own men. He wanted them to see what fate awaited them should they not conquer their enemy. This form of psychological leadership was also mirrored by Crassus. Now Crassus was infamous in this war for reviving the practice of decimation among his legions. In the face of his lieutenant Mummius disobeying orders not to engage, and seeing the vanquished troops flee from Spartacus's men, he ordered 1 out of 10 of those men be drawn at random by lot. Those chosen by fate would suffer the indignity of being beaten to death by their own comrades. Despite the barbarity of this practice, strategic credit is due to Crassus for this decision. Spartacus's victories had often rested on overconfident Roman forces being forced to rout. Crassus had ensured that the troops would fear punishment for cowardice, more than the rebel army that they faced. But to return to the crucifixion of the Roman soldier, this event exemplified the brutal nature of this war. Neither side was sparing prisoners. The rebels were reported to have made a mockery of the gladiatorial games that their leaders had been forced to participate in, by making Roman captives fight each other. There are also references to Spartacus slaughtering prisoners in order to expedite the movement of his forces. The Romans, for their part, crucified every rebel they caught. Earlier on, this conflict was seen more as an exercise in policing, and even in the latter stages of the war, the fate of a rebellious slave was already set as soon as they fell back into Roman hands. The fear Spartacus instilled in his troops clearly worked, as combined with some typical ingenuity, they managed to bridge the ditch and conquer the fortifications in their way. From here they continued to head north. Despite Crassus clearly being set on a cautious campaign, that rested on the certainty that Spartacus would not keep up his unlikely victories forever, Rome and the Senate were not so patient. This dishonourable war had persisted for far too long. Now Crassus himself had seemingly requested the recall of Pompey to Italy following his defeat of Sertorius, and Rome, upon hearing Pompey had crossed through Cisalpine Gaul, gave him immediate orders to head south and finish the slave rebellion. Having failed to destroy Spartacus in the south, Crassus was now obviously less enthused to hear Pompey had indeed returned. A potential insurance policy now threatened to steal his thunder, and he hastily followed on the heels of the rebels to ensure it was he who reaped the glory and not his political rival. His attitude on the thought of open battle with Spartacus had switched, and it was now worth the risk to seek a final confrontation. At some stage in these events, Spartacus would attempt possibly his boldest act to date. With Pompey's arrival looming, he would look to offer a truce to Crassus. The reasoning is uncertain as to why he did this. It may have been a sign of how desperate he viewed the situation. Appian seems to have believed Spartacus did this as an attempt to leverage Crassus's fear that Pompey would steal his victory. The sources then note that this attempt at parley was rejected with scorn on the Roman side. Spartacus was now also facing difficulty within his own ranks. Prior to the final battle, a mutiny appears to have occurred, which cost him 12,000 or so of his men, who chose to follow 2 rebels named Castus and Gannicus. Like with the previous schism that saw Spartacus and Crixus part ways, this may well have been down ethnic lines. Castus and Gannicus were Celts, and no doubt many of their followers were as well. Castus and Gannicus would inevitably fare no better than Crixus. Despite Spartacus attempting to distract Crassus and shield his mutinous former comrades, the Romans were able to isolate and crush them entirely. Plutarch noted that these men did not suffer any wounds to their backs. They did not flee and they did not surrender. They died fighting bravely, knowing there was no escape. Sometime after this event, the Roman vanguard was able to catch up with the rebels who were still heading north. A lieutenant of Crassus called Scroffa unwisely chose to engage Spartacus and was soundly defeated. Spartacus had turned around to destroy the Roman vanguard, and although this was a success, the sources and the historians agree it may well have ruined him eventually. High on victory, this event persuaded the majority of his men that their only real option was to turn and fight. Like with his failure to convince them to cross the Alps and disperse to their homelands, Spartacus was again losing control. Finally, word would reach him that heading east to the heel of Italy was no longer an option either. Marcus Lucullus, another Roman commander, had returned from Macedonia on orders to aid with the suppression of the slave rebellion. Now unable to retreat south, head east, or continue further north, with Pompey advancing to meet them too, Spartacus had very few options in terms of movement. and with his companions no longer willing to run, he made the choice to seek the final battle with Crassus. This was exactly what Crassus wanted, and you can get a sense from the sources that while Spartacus played into his hands, the Thracian commander made this choice in some level of despair. Near the banks of the Selly River, Crassus attempted to have his men build further fortifications, and he camped provocatively near the enemy. Upon seeing the Roman engineers once again at work, the rebels sallied out to meet the advanced legionaries and engage them. This harassment prevented further walls of circumvallation from being established, and assured a typical pitched battle would be the deciding fight. The place of the final battle was now set. At this point, it is worth previewing the two forces that lined up to face each other. Florus in his writings described the rebel army as follows. Being joined by new forces day after day, and forming themselves into a regular army, they made themselves out of osiers and beasts' hides a rude kind of shield, and out of the iron from the slave houses forged swords and other weapons. And that nothing proper might be wanting to the complement of the army, they procured cavalry by breaking in the herds of horses that came in their way, and conferred upon their leader the ensigns and fasces that they took from the praetors. So once again you get a sense of the makeshift army they had formed. Much of their equipment they had chanced upon, and there was a strong vein of improvisation among their makeup. Additionally, the incorporation of stolen banners suggests they sought to copy what worked from their enemies. As far as the Roman army of this era goes, the legionaries wore mail coats with bronze or iron helmets and held a big oblong shield, and for offense they carried a javelin and a short sword known as a gladius. Certainly more heavily armoured than their opponents, and with a better standard of weapon on average. The best that Crassus' money could buy, no doubt. The Romans started with their arrows, and then slings as well up to 100 yards off. At 50 foot they would throw javelins. Then they would charge on the run into close combat. In his book, Strauss compares the ancient Roman battle to a boxing match, in that it was episodic. The two sides clashed in melee, then they would break apart, and then they regrouped from a distance, and then they charged at each other again. Eventually, after a few bouts of this, one army collapses and runs. Battles typically would last 2 to 3 hours in this fashion, but the actual fighting would only last in bouts of 15 to 20 minutes. The numbers of men involved in the battle are not certain, but then there are fairly few sources to choose from. The highest number in the sources comes from Oresius, who was not even close to being a contemporary writer, but he claimed the slaves suffered 60,000 casualties, as well as 6,000 being captured. No doubt these figures also include women and children who were part of the rebels, and interestingly, Oresius supplies an extra piece of information, recovered in the aftermath of the battle, with 3,000 Roman citizens who were being held captive by Spartacus. Clearly the rebel camp held more than just fighting men at this time. In terms of what more modern historians think, Spartacus' army is most likely to have ranged from 30,000 to 40,000 men. And the legions of Crassus at this point would have numbered at 40,000, a figure which is stated with more certainty. So the numbers were about even, and if any advantage on the numbers side was held at all, it was most likely held by the Romans. The advantage of security and morale also no doubt lay with the Romans too. Despite not having an overwhelming numbers advantage as they lined up to face their enemy, they were well aware that a tide of reinforcements were incoming. Their prey was well and truly trapped without any real hope in the long term, though of course a man backed against the wall with no escape could potentially prove extremely dangerous. Even in his despair, Spartacus clearly endeavoured to make the overconfident Romans pay once again. Given that the historians maintain that the rebel slaves did desire some level of vengeance in their actions, and no doubt they were aware that the overall situation was hopeless, it seems they resolved themselves to commit murderous suicide as their final action. The bloody nature of this battle tells of the desperation of the men involved, and as with the mutinous party that followed Castus and Gannicus to their end, these men were not looking to suffer wounds to their backs. They would die fighting and take as many Romans with them to the afterlife as they possibly could. A striking part of Plutarch's source details the speech Spartacus gave his troops before the battle. It was a curious piece of theatre and ritual sacrifice. As fresh supplies came in on either side, Spartacus, seeing there was no avoiding it, set all his army in array, and when his horse was brought him, he drew out his sword and killed him, saying, if he got the day, he should have a great many better horses of the enemy's, and if he lost it, he should have no need of his. It was not unusual necessarily for commanders in the ancient world to dismount from their horse and fight among the foot soldiers in an effort to raise morale, and also specifically strengthen the infantry, should their part of the fight be the most strategically important aspect of the battle. Spartacus in this instance, though, had taken this a step or two further, and no doubt this was not just pageantry or an inspirational tactic. Religion and mysticism were of paramount importance to the ancient peoples, and the horse was sacred to not just Spartacus' own homeland of Thrace, but also the area that his reported wife came from, a priestess of the Mede tribe. Neither the importance of the horse or religious ritual would have been lost on Spartacus himself. But putting aside any religious ritual in this act, Spartacus had no doubt also made a bold and striking move. The plan for the battle was now set in stone. By fighting on foot, he limited the effect he would be able to have on the flow of battle. Neither the vision nor the mobility afforded to a mounted general would be available to him. But he clearly determined that he would have no need for these advantages. He had one singular goal in mind as far as battle strategy. His strategy was Crassus. If he was once again to win the most unlikely of victories, he would do so by slaying the enemy commander in single combat. As far as the story of the battle goes, the sources show it was entirely defined by this decision. One of my favourite parts of Barry Strauss's book, in his description of Spartacus' attempt on Crassus, his single-minded charge is related as one of the most dramatic and unforgettable moments left to us in the accounts of ancient warfare. Even though the details are scarce, we are left in little doubt that even the Romans had nothing but respect for the gladiator general's personal bravery that he displayed in this act. To return to the account from Plutarch, and so making directly towards Crassus himself through the midst of arms and wounds, he missed him, but slew 2 centurions that fell upon him together. This line once again provides some much needed colour and detail to the battle. It also attests to Spartacus' own prowess in combat. He killed 2 centurions in hand-to-hand fighting, trying to meet Crassus on the field. Even as officers, centurions would always fight from the front, so as to inspire morale and reorganize their men where necessary. From necessity, they would be extremely well versed in single combat, and as veterans probably among the finer soldiers on the Roman side. But despite their elite status, they were not trained to the absolute pinnacle of single combat. They were not trained to fight gladiators. These men whose entire life revolved around combat facing men equally so trained. Now there was a Roman battle honour worth talking about here called Spoila Opima, which translates as rich spoils. Essentially it refers to the occasion of a Roman commander defeating a rival general in single combat on the field of battle. Following their victory, they would strip the opponent of their arms and armour. Along with capturing an enemy's standard and the peaks of warships in naval battle, it was the most honourable war trophy a Roman could be expected to win. And Rome only recognised 3 occasions where this had happened. The first was in its legendary history, when Romulus achieved it following the mythical rape of the Sabine women. The second was achieved by Aulus Cornelius Cossus, who achieved this in the 5th century BC, although this period is also considered semi-legendary at best. The most likely occurrence historically was by Marcus Claudius Marcellus just prior to the Second Punic War, when he stripped the slain Celtic king Viridomarus of his armour. A goal considered so honourable to the Romans may explain some of the respect shown by the sources to Spartacus as he attempted this in the battle. But despite clear evidence from the sources of his martial ability, Spartacus was not able to overcome the odds on his sheer might and bravery alone. Plutarch and Appian disagree on whether he fell alone or within the ranks of his men. Plutarch has him cut a lonely figure, standing bravely against the Roman counterattack, with his men once again deserting him. Appian, however, says he suffered a wound to the thigh from a javelin, potentially a dishonourable way to be defeated, as he suffered the telling blow from a missile, but was clearly not found wanting in close combat. From his knees he held his shield in front of him and continued the fight until he was cut to pieces along with a mass of men at his side. Whatever the true detail on his death, it is fairly certain he was wounded, and then surrounded, and then he was killed. I actually consider Plutarch's version of the events unlikely. As we will discuss later, there was difficulty in finding the body of Spartacus, and if he had been defeated without his comrades falling beside him, I would personally assume this would not have been the case. Almost all the surviving sources praise Spartacus for the nature of his death in battle, none more so than Florus, who in his final words on the rebel leader declared that Spartacus almost became as an imperator to his men. Imperator was a rank of great honour in the late Roman Republic. It was a title conferred on commanders by their own legionaries, and this acclamation was a necessity prior to being awarded a triumph by the Senate. After the fall of the Republic, Augustus would restrict its usage to just emperors and, at a stretch, members of the royal family. As Florus was writing this after the change in official use, you get an idea of how much honour he was conveying by using this word. It was more than just acknowledging his valour as a general, it recognised his importance to the people he had led. His symbolic and inspirational importance was certainly evident in the impact his loss had on his men. The rebel army completely crumbled without their leader. Whatever discipline, training, and cohesion they had achieved was lost, and they were cut down en masse. Appian states that confusion spread throughout the ranks, they were butchered in crowds, and so great was the slaughter that it was impossible to count the dead. The Romans, for their part, only lost 1,000 men by Appian's record. This suggests that Spartacus may have been killed fairly early into the fighting, and the remainder of the fight was a drawn-out slaughter, where the Romans took advantage of the rebel disarray to drive them into killing zones. By the numbers, it was an overwhelming victory. The Romans had lost little more than 2.5% of their original forces. Spartacus' body was not identified among the rebel dead after the battle. There is a chance that due to the brutality of the fighting, his corpse may have been unrecognizable due to wounds. But equally, he may have simply been dressed too much like his subordinates. He is noted to have shared plunder impartially, and he also banned the trade in gold and silver among his men. We can infer from this behaviour that he may not have dressed in much finery on the battlefield. Sadly for any archaeologist looking to relocate his remains, his final resting place would likely have been a mass grave not far from the battlefield. While the Romans would have ensured their comrades were burned on funeral pyres, they would not have wasted any wood on the rebel slaves. There are a few what-ifs in this story. Spartacus had shown tremendous valour and aptitude as a battlefield or guerrilla commander, but it is fair to say he failed as a leader of men. He failed to convince his men of the proper course. Had he convinced them to disperse over the Alps, the rebellion would no doubt have been a success story. Had he been luckier, and had the pirates not abandoned him in Sicily, he may have escaped Crassus and extended the campaign into new territory. For the vast majority of his followers, their story had run its course. The legions mopped up what they could of the forces that remained on the battlefield, the ones that looked to die fighting. Appian provides a bit more colour as to what the fleeing remnants of the rebels tried to achieve once they had disengaged. By his account, they split off into 4 groups, elected new leaders, and sought to continue the guerrilla campaign in the mountains. For his part, Crassus did not let them slip away easily. His legions gave chase into the mountain ranges, and proceeded to flush out and destroy any bands of men they came across. Based on the figures reported, captured by the Romans, it is clear the majority of the fugitives were either killed at the battle or were tracked down and killed later. Pompey had arrived further to the north and was reported to have met and destroyed a force of 5,000 remnants of the rebel army. Whether this was an organised force or a band of refugees that had wisely tried to remove themselves to the safety in the wake of Crassus is unknown. Crassus is reported to have captured 6,000 from his side of the operations. Bearing in mind the low rebel figure for the final battle was 30,000 men, and no doubt their camp included accompanying women and children, it is clear the vast majority were actively killed during the campaign. As well as the human captives, the victorious generals also symbolically recaptured a slither of Roman honour. Crassus and Pompey located and recovered the stolen standards and fasces of the previously defeated commanders. The return of these items was a cause for great celebration, and no doubt healed some of the wounded pride felt in Rome that this lowly war against slaves had even been fought in the first place. With a common foe dead, however, the political game at the apex of Roman society picked up in earnest. Pompey laid claim to the victory in this war. He did so on the basis that he was the one that crushed the final remnants of Spartacus' followers, while Crassus and his officers were still hunting the small groups who had fled into the mountain ranges. The fear that drove Crassus to force Spartacus to the field had come to pass, and Pompey was indeed trying to steal his laurels. Quite literally. Whether it was Pompey's attempt to steal credit, or the official line that this war was far too beneath the dignity of Rome to even celebrate victory, Crassus was denied the triumph that he sought for his efforts. He was instead awarded with an ovation, a much more muted affair than a triumph, where the procession would take place on foot. Crassus did reportedly get to wear a laurel wreath, though, upon his own request. This was an honour that was usually reserved just for a triumph. Pompey, for his victories in Hispania, would celebrate a triumph in the same year. So while he had clearly hoped for more gratitude from the Roman hierarchy and the Senate, Crassus did find political capital where he could. He marched the 6,000 captives 75 miles south to Capua and crucified them on the way to Rome. This act of mass execution was considered by many a writer to have taken place along the Appian Way, but there were in fact two roads to Rome, and the sources do not actually specify which one was used. What is striking about this is that Crassus ensured the punishment took place near the scene of the original slave breakout, and Roman jurors of the time did recommend particularly notorious criminals receive punishment near to where they committed their transgressions. But while Crassus may have felt some deeper need to enact justice, the main message was also clear. It was he that had delivered the justice Rome sought. And he would have paid for the entire endeavour out of his own pocket, enough money to ensure the 6,000 captives were kept alive long enough to first be tortured by scourging, and then fixed in place on crosses to die. And every Roman or slave that walked down the road between the two great cities would know that this justice was an achievement of Crassus. And why was such a lesson necessary? Well, Spartacus and his followers had not fought just the armies of Rome, but really the entire foundation of Roman society itself. This was an empire built from the ground up and top down to keep slaves in their place. Their entire lives were a necessary economic contribution to keep the Roman machine moving. It is unknown if they were aiming to end slavery as an institution. It is certainly not mentioned by any of the sources. However, in the end, the rebellion would count as a little more than a footnote in the great political game played by the ambitious Roman elites. The empire would be engulfed in civil war again within the next lifetime. There would also be no immediate reckoning with regards to the institution of slavery, although potentially this entire episode would become a tale for future Roman writers to refer to when they were cautioning against harsh treatment of slaves. So I highly recommend for further reading Barry Strauss's book, The Spartacus War. It's possible to learn a lot from the sources in terms of history and colour, but Strauss does a great job of fleshing out the gaps in knowledge with context from other areas of research into Roman military and culture, as well as the cultures of the ethnic groups that made up their rebel foe. I'm going to upload a follow-up video to this one discussing the historiography of Spartacus and how he's been remembered throughout the early modern and late modern period. So look out for that sometime next week. Many thanks for listening to me ramble on, and until next time, farewell.